desert. We're talking about a truly catastrophic event, one that really changed everything about how we fly, how things get regulated, maybe even how we trust authority. The Grand Canyon mid-air collision. TWA Flight 2, United Flight 718. 128 people lost their lives. It's still, a huge moment in aviation history.
Yeah, a terrible, terrible tragedy. And, the thing is, it was the event, the one single thing that led directly to the creation of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration.
The FAA.
Right.
Centralizing control over all U.S. airspace.
Exactly. Before that, it was much more, kind of the Wild West up there. Pilots used a see and be seen approach. This crash basically ended that era overnight and brought in mandatory federal oversight.
Okay, so that's the official history, the established narrative. Terrible accident leads to necessary safety regulations, a bigger government agency. Makes sense on the surface. But the source material you brought in, it asks a really provocative question, a skeptical one. Was this really just a tragic accident? Or, and this is the core of our deep dive today, does the way the evidence or lack thereof lines up suggest something else, like maybe an engineered crisis, a false flag or a psyop, something designed specifically to create the public demand, the political will for that huge expansion of federal power, and let's be honest, the massive industry contracts that came with it.
That's exactly the uncomfortable question the sources force us to confront. We're pulling together research on the crash itself, obviously, but also digging into the history of psychological operations, psyops, and this darker area of how consensus reality, what everyone agrees is true, can actually be fabricated, manufactured almost.
Right, and you mentioned this phrase, perfect evidential vacuum. That seems key here. The crash that supposedly proved we needed mandatory flight recorders. It happened before those recorders were mandatory. So there were no black boxes, no CVRs, nothing electronic to actually verify what happened on those planes.
Precisely. It's not just a missing piece of data.
Oh.
It's like the structure of the event itself justifies the outcome. The crash supposedly showed the need for recorders, but it had none to confirm the story.
It's a perfectly closed loop.
It is. The outcome, this massive federal expansion, gets all the public support, all the political backing, but the actual cause, the thing that kicked it all off, it's fundamentally unverifiable because the technology wasn't there. And it's this structure, this convenient arrangement where the solution is demanded, but the problem itself can't be independently proven. That's what makes this worth a really deep, careful look.
Okay, so let's dig into the foundations here. Because when you really look at the official story, well, it feels a bit shaky, doesn't it? The whole conclusion, mid-air collision, seems to rest on surprisingly thin physical evidence.
The sources definitely back that up. I mean, the investigation, it was run by the CAV, the Civil Aeronautics Board. And you have to remember who the CAB was.
Right, the CAB. And they were basically investigating the problem that would put them out of a job, essentially, replaced by the bigger, stronger FAA.
Exactly. Talk about a conflict of interest, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't have much to go on, some wreckage analysis, but in really difficult terrain, forensic reconstruction done only by government investigators, and that one radio transmission.
The famous transmission. Everyone kind of remembers that from the news clips. Salt Lake, United 718, we're going in. And you hear shouting in the background, pull up. Sounds pretty conclusive.
It sounds dramatic, absolutely. But it's basically the only piece of immediate sort of electronic era proof there is. And we have to hammer this home. There were no flight data recorders, no cockpit voice recorders, no homing beacons on either of those planes in 1956.
Wow, zero.
Zero electronic logs. The technology existed, some of it, but it just wasn't mandatory for commercial flights yet. So nothing to definitively show altitude, speed, course changes, what the pilots were actually doing or saying right before impact.
So the very law this crash supposedly justified, the Federal Aviation Act of 58, that law mandated the exact technology that, if it had been on those planes in 56, would have answered all the questions.
It's just exquisitely convenient, isn't it? A regulatory closed loop.
Yeah, it's the definition of that evidential vacuum you mentioned. The system was clearly broken, the crash proved it, and the fix required this huge new federal power, new taxes, new equipment rules.
And all without any pesky, verifiable data from the crash itself that might have complicated the preferred narrative.
Okay, beyond the lack of electronic evidence, what about just the physics, the sheer odds? If we assume it was just a random tragic collision, the sources looked at the probability, right? Two planes hitting each other in that huge sky.
They did. And the airspace volume, we're talking about 21,000 feet altitude over that part of the canyon. It's vast. roughly 39,000, maybe 40,000 cubic miles of air. If you just calculate the odds of two planes randomly bumping into each other in that much space, the probability is, well, it's effectively zero. Something like 0.000000007%. Statistically negligible in a vacuum.
Okay, but I can hear people thinking it wasn't a vacuum. Like you said, uncontrolled airspace, pilots maybe being a bit cavalier.
And that's the necessary counterpoint. The sources absolutely address that. The probability goes way up dramatically because the pilots weren't flying randomly. They were both apparently intentionally heading towards the same spot over the canyon
What?
to give the passengers a better view, providing scenic views, as the reports say, flying at the same altitude for the best sight, reducing their separation.
Okay, that makes sense. That explains why it happened right there, over the Grand Canyon. They were off their planned routes, getting close for the tourists. It was a known risky practice, maybe.
It does explain the location, yes. But this is where the sources introduce what they call the probabilistic convergence problem. It's a bit of a paradox. Right? If this practice flying close together at the same altitude over a major landmark for tourism, if that was genuinely common, a regular thing pilots did back then,
Right.
then why weren't there more crashes like this? Especially in that specific popular Grand Canyon corridor in the years just before 1956.
That's a really sharp point. If taking that risk was standard operating procedure for sightseeing, you'd expect statistically, maybe not crashes every week, but certainly more near misses, maybe minor incidents reported in that area beforehand.
You absolutely would. And the sources point out, look, there were mid-air collisions happening elsewhere, 65 of them between 1950 and 55. So the overall system was flawed, no question. But none of those happened over such a symbolic, nationally significant landmark. None had this massive death toll. And critically, none resulted in this immediate, perfectly tailored regulatory overhaul, the creation of the FAA.
So the argument is the combination is suspicious. Maximum tragedy, iconic location, perfect timing for a pre-desired regulatory outcome. It was almost too perfect.
That's what the sources imply warrants the deep skepticism. The event was uniquely, perfectly suited to the specific solution that followed. Too perfectly, perhaps.
All right, so the electronic data is non-existent. The statistical likelihood is weirdly paradoxical. Now let's talk about the physical evidence from the next part. The wreckage itself. Where did it end up?
Well, that's the next layer. The crash sites are in one of the most rugged, inaccessible places in North America. And crucially, parts of it are federally restricted areas.
So the evidential vacuum we talked about, it's not just about missing data, it becomes a physical reality. The evidence is literally hard or impossible to get to.
Precisely. The National Park Service itself confirms this. They state that substantial aircraft debris is still out there at all the sites, and that the main debris fields overlap significantly with these federally restricted zones. The sources call them the forbidden zones.
So the investigation, by definition, couldn't even be fully completed. They couldn't retrieve everything.
They're not even close. Let's look at the specific spots. For TWA Flight 2, the wreckage scattered across Temple Butte. That area falls within what the NPS officially designates the Hopi Salt Mines Complete Ban Zone. Access is completely prohibited, period.
Complete ban zone. Okay, and the other plane, United 718.
That debris is mostly near Shore Butte, close to a confluence considered sacred. The terrain there is just unbelievably difficult. Sheer cliffs, deep crevasses. The initial recovery reports mention needing Swiss mountaineers with ropes and piddle-toms just to get to some of it.
Swiss mountaineers. Wow. So, okay, it sounds like getting to the debris is genuinely hard because of the cliffs and canyons. That makes sense.
It does. The stated reasons for why recovery is incomplete and why independent visits are banned are twofold. One, the extreme terrain makes it physically impossible or dangerous to retrieve everything, especially smaller fragments lodged in cliffs. And two, the need to protect sacred indigenous sites like the Hopi Salt Mines area. Those are the official justifications.
But, and here's where the skepticism the sources raise comes back in. How credible is that sacred site protection argument, really? Especially when you look at the government's track record elsewhere.
That's the critical connection the sources make. They point to a long, documented history of the federal government, frankly, ignoring or overriding indigenous land rights and sacred site protections when there's an economic or military incentive.
Right, we've seen examples like protected areas being reduced for uranium mining interests.
Exactly. Or the fight over Oak Flat in Arizona for copper mining, despite its significance to Apache tribes. Or think about the Dakota Access Pipeline militarized police deployed against protesters trying to protect water and sacred grounds.
So the pattern is usually economic interests trump cultural or environmental protection.
That's often been the case, historically. which makes the government's sudden, absolute, unwavering insistence on protecting these specific sacred sites, the ones conveniently covering the crash debris, seem, well, questionable to the skeptical sources.
Especially when that protection directly serves to keep the physical evidence inaccessible and prevent any independent verification of the official crash narrative.
It creates what philosophers call an epistemic problem, a fundamental problem related to knowledge. How can we know what really happened if the physical evidence is permanently off limits? The restrictions mean no independent researchers can ever go there to verify what was initially recovered or what might still be there. Could there be anomalous wreckage? Non-standard materials? We can never know.
The debris fields become physically unretrievable, locking the official story in place not by proof, but by controlling access to potential counter evidence.
Right. The question hangs in the air. If the government often disregards these sites when there's money to be made, why the sudden ironclad protectionism here where it perfectly shields the official account of the crash?
Okay, so if the evidence is locked away, maybe forever in these forbidden zones, the question shifts, doesn't it? It's less about what physically happens second by second and more about cui bono, who gained. Let's use that framework from the sources. Motive, opportunity, means. It helps assess if an engineered crisis is even plausible. The idea is that using a big, shocking disaster to push an agenda isn't new. It's kind of a playbook.
Exactly. We move from the specific anomalies of the crash evidence to the broader structural incentives. Who benefited from the specific event unfolding exactly as it did?
Let's start with motive. Who stood to gain the most from this crash, happening where and when it did, leading directly to the FAA and massive regulation?
Oh, the list of beneficiaries lines up almost perfectly with the outcome. First and foremost, obviously, the push for federal aviation control expansion. The FAA itself was born from this. Second, guaranteed contracts for defense and aerospace companies. Think Lockheed Martin, Boeing, the big players. Suddenly there's a mandate for transponders, radar systems, eventually black boxes. Massive guaranteed revenue streams created overnight.
Right, it wasn't just about safety rules, it was about building a whole new federally mandated technological infrastructure.
Absolutely. Third, it allowed for new taxation frameworks within the growing aviation industry. And finally, it likely accelerated industry consolidation. Bigger airlines could absorb the costs of new regulations much easier than smaller independent operators.
That's a powerful alignment of interests. Government expansion, corporate profits, industry reshaping. This wasn't just a minor tweak, it set the stage for the entire modern aviation ecosystem.
Precisely. And the timing, mid-50s commercial aviation was booming, moving from sort of a post-war luxury to potentially a mass market. It was chaotic. Both regulators and the established industry players would have seen a strong motive to bring order, control, and predictable profit to that chaos.
Okay, powerful motive. What about opportunity? Was the situation in 56 such that a crisis could be engineered or exploited in this way?
The sources argue, yes, absolutely. You had vast stretches of uncontrolled airspace, federal lands like the Grand Canyon. No radar coverage means few, if any, independent ground witnesses to verify aircraft positions. It happened on a holiday weekend, which guaranteed maximum passenger loads on both planes. This maximizes the tragedy, the emotional impact, the public outcry for something to be done.
More impact, more pressure for action.
Exactly. You also had experienced pilots flying both planes. Ironically, this helps the narrative because you can't just blame it on rookie mistakes. It points to a systemic failure, justifying systemic change. And crucially, the weather conditions were officially cited as a factor, pilots maneuvering around towering cumulus clouds. This provides a convenient, simple explanation, poor visibility, rather than needing to delve into complex technical failures or, other possibilities. It makes the narrative flexible.
Okay, motive and opportunity seem plausible according to the sources. What about the means? How could they ensure the crisis resulted in the desired outcome, the FAA, without contradiction?
This comes back to the control of information and access, securing the narrative. First, the CAB investigates itself, as we discussed. The agency whose failures, real or perceived, led to the crisis is in charge of explaining it.
Huge conflict of interest baked in.
Baked right in. Second, the physical evidence is made permanently inaccessible, locked away by terrain and federal restrictions, as we just covered. And third, the absolute killer point. No electronic flight data existed on those planes to contradict whatever conclusion the investigators reached. Plus, the investigation took about 10 months. That's plenty of time for the official story to be shaped, refined, and solidified before the legislation creating the FAA was formally pushed through Congress in 1958. The whole structure seems geared towards a predetermined conclusion, not necessarily an exhaustive search for truth.
Now, it feels important to stress this idea of leveraging a crisis, manufacturing consent. It's not just some wild conspiracy theory pulled out of thin air for this one event. The sources emphasize this is a documented pattern, right? There are historical precedents.
Absolutely vital point. This isn't speculation in a vacuum. The sources provide clear historical examples of this crisis response consolidation playbook in action. It shows how manipulating public perception to achieve economic or political goals is, unfortunately, a well-established technique.
Okay, let's touch on a couple of those. The classic example often cited is Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, nephew of Freud.
Right. Bernays was a master manipulator of the public mind in the early 20th century. One famous case. Lucky Strike cigarettes hired him in the 1920s because women weren't really smoking in public. It was taboo, hurting sales. Bernays didn't just run ads saying smoking is okay for women. No, he engineered an event. During the 1929 Easter parade in New York City, he arranged for a group of fashionable debutantes to dramatically light up cigarettes, calling them torches of freedom.
Torches of freedom, linking smoking directly to the women's suffrage movement, to liberation, to rebellion.
Exactly. He brilliantly framed smoking not as a habit, but as a political statement, a symbol of female empowerment. He manufactured a connection, a hyperstition. And guess what?
Sales went up.
Sales of Lucky Strikes to women absolutely soared. He didn't just respond to demand, he created it by hijacking a powerful social narrative.
Wow. Okay, a more mundane example the sources mentioned, soap carving.
Yeah, sounds weird, right? But during the Great Depression, major soap companies heavily promoted and funded nationwide soap carving contests and curricula in schools. They framed it as promoting art, cleanliness, good values for kids.
Okay, seems harmless enough.
But the hidden motive, soap carving obviously uses up a lot of soap, driving demand for replacement bars, and apparently it often got kids' clothes dirty, which then required more laundry detergent.
Huh. So they embedded demand generation right into the education system. Clever in a way.
Very clever. Engineered demand, pure and simple.
And maybe the most impactful long-term example the sources bring up is the food pyramid.
Ah, yes. The infamous food pyramid inversion. This was later, 1977, when the USDA released its first major dietary guidelines. The sources argue compellingly that these guidelines were heavily influenced, not primarily by nutritional science, but by powerful agricultural lobbies.
Lobbies dealing with grain surpluses mainly.
Exactly. Grain and, to some extent, beef. The result was that the pyramid's base, the thing you're supposed to eat the most of 6 to 11 servings a day, was grains. Bread, cereal, rice, pasta. Fruits and vegetables were higher up, smaller portions. Fats and oils at the very top, used sparingly.
Completely flipping what many nutritionists would recommend today, and done primarily to manage agricultural surpluses, not public health.
That's the argument, subordinating science to economic and political interests. And, many link those guidelines directly to the subsequent explosion in obesity, diabetes, and related health issues in America.
So when you see that pattern, Bernays, soap carving, the food pyramid it makes, looking at the Grand Canyon crash through the same lens. Well, less far-fetched, doesn't it? A crisis, followed by a response that just happens to massively benefit powerful government and industry players. It fits the mold.
It fits the playbook precisely. That's the structural argument the sources present.
Okay, so if we entertain the possibility, based on the motive, opportunity, means, and historical precedents, if the Grand Canyon crash was somehow an engineered or exploited crisis, then the mechanism for controlling the narrative wouldn't just be about hiding wreckage in a canyon, right? The sources suggest it would likely involve more sophisticated techniques mirroring actual psychological operations designed to manage information and essentially neutralize truth-seeking.
This is where it gets really deep, into the mechanics of perception control. The sources introduce this concept, sometimes associated with UFO research or intelligence analysis, of a control system.
A control system, like the government or corporate power or...
It could be any or all of those, or perhaps something more abstract. The idea is that this system doesn't always use brute force. It uses shifting narratives, changing stories, what the sources call avatars, to subtly influence collective consciousness, to tweak how we perceive reality.
Avatars, like different masks or fronts for the same underlying control mechanism.
Kind of. And the primary tool this system uses, according to these sources, is hyperstition. We need to be really clear on this term.
Yeah, let's define that carefully. It sounds like superstition, but more.
Exactly. Think of it this way. A superstition is a belief without working on wood. A hyperstition is more potent. It's a fiction, a story, an idea that once it's introduced and enough people start believing in it and acting on it, it actually starts to have real-world causal effects. It becomes functionally real because people treat it as real.
Okay, give me an example.
The classic one is money itself, especially modern finance. Historically, money was tied to gold, something tangible. But modern credit, derivatives, complex financial instruments, they're essentially elaborate stories, shared fictions about future value that we all agree to believe in. Because we collectively act as if these fictions are real, they fundamentally shape the global economy. The fiction gains causal power. It becomes hyperstitional.
All right, so applying that to the Grand Canyon crash, the hyperstition would be the narrative itself. Tragic, random accident caused by inadequate rules proves we desperately need the FAA.
Precisely. That narrative, whether initially true or deliberately crafted, gets repeated, amplified by the media, accepted by the public, and people's behavior changes accordingly. They demand action, Congress acts, the FAA is created, airlines buy new equipment. The fiction bootstraps itself into reality.
The story retrofits the facts, or the lack of facts.
Exactly. It's a powerful social feedback loop. And the sources provide a chilling real-world example of how a government agency actually used hyperstition as a deliberate psyop tool to neutralize a perceived threat. This is the Paul Bennewitz case.
Okay, this sounds important. Tell us about Bennewitz. Late 70s, early 80s.
Right. Paul Bennewitz was a physicist, an electronics expert running a company right next to Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. Because of his location and his technical skills, he started detecting strange electronic signals and observing unusual aerial phenomena.
What was he actually detecting?
He was likely picking up early tests of classified stealth aircraft and possibly intercepting sensitive, encrypted military communications. He wasn't crazy, he was technically competent and stumbling onto real secrets.
So he was a problem for the Air Force. He was getting too close.
A huge problem. But the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI, didn't just shut him down or tell him he was wrong. They launched an incredibly sophisticated counterintelligence operation against him.
What did they do?
They didn't deny his findings, they confirmed them, but in a twisted way. They decided to feed his paranoia, to essentially drown him in disinformation. They started feeding him forged documents, staged events, and create these incredibly elaborate, detailed stories.
Stories about what?
About hostile aliens, malevolent extraterrestrials operating out of huge, secret underground bases beneath New Mexico, collaborating with parts of the government, abducting people, a whole mythology.
Wow. They fed him the entire UFO conspiracy narrative, basically.
Custom built for him, delivered through seemingly credible channels, exploiting his existing data but reinterpreting it through this hyperstitional alien lens. They ran this operation for years.
What was the goal?
The lead AFOSI agent involved later admitted the goal was, and this is a direct quote concept, to completely dismantle a person's world from the inside out, until his evidence became unbelievable and his mind finally broke.
To neutralize him by making him seem crazy?
Exactly. Bennewitz became utterly consumed by fighting the fictional alien threat. His real, potentially valid observations about classified military tech got completely buried under this mountain of induced paranoia about ETs. He was discredited, hospitalized, and effectively silenced.
That's profoundly disturbing. They used a hyperstitional narrative, the alien threat, as a smokescreen to protect actual state secrets.
Precisely. And it poisoned the well for anyone else asking legitimate questions about strange activity near Kirtland. If you raise concerns, you risked being lumped in with Bennewitz's crazy alien theories. It was a brutally effective psyop using manufactured reality.
Okay, I see the parallel. So how does this connect back to locking in the Grand Canyon narrative? It's not like they told people aliens caused the crash.
No, but the mechanism of narrative control is similar, particularly how collective memory works. The sources talk about something called socially shared, retrieval-induced forgetting.
Okay, that sounds complicated. Break that down.
It's actually pretty intuitive when you think about how groups talk about things. When a group discusses a shared memory, like a major news event, they tend to focus on certain aspects, usually the most dramatic, emotional, or simple ones. So for the Grand Canyon crash, conversation focuses on the horror, the tragedy, the heroism of rescuers, the clear need for something to change, the simple explanation, planes hit clouds each other.
Right, the headline story.
Exactly. And the act of repeatedly retrieving and discussing those specific details, the retrieval practice, actually causes the group members to actively suppress and forget other related details that aren't being discussed.
So, by constantly talking about the spectacle and the simple accident narrative, the collective conversation actively pushes out the more complex, uncomfortable details.
Precisely. Things like the specific economic motives of the industries involved, the history of regulatory failures before this specific crash, the conflicts of interest in the investigation, the weirdness of the inaccessible evidence. Those details get systematically forgotten because they aren't part of the dominant, repeated story.
Retrieval of one memory induces the forgetting of related ones.
That's the principle. And the sources note this effect is much stronger for emotionally charged events like a plane crash with huge loss of life. False or simplified memories spread incredibly fast in these conditions. One study mentioned found that 64% of individual false memories became shared by the group after just 3 rounds of discussion.
64% after just 3 conversations. That's incredibly fast.
It shows how quickly a consensus narrative, true or false, can take hold and overwrite nuance or contradictory facts, especially when fueled by emotion and amplified by media. The spectacular tragedy narrative effectively smothers the potentially more complex political and economic reality behind the FAA's creation.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, the evidence vacuum, the inaccessible sites, the motive opportunity means analysis, the historical plays like hyperstition and induced forgetting, it leads us to what the sources call the core structural conclusion about the Grand Canyon crash evidence. We have these 2 competing ideas. Hypothesis A, it was a genuine tragic accident made worse by poor rules. Versus hypothesis B, it was an engineered or deliberately exploited crisis used to justify federal expansion.
Right. 2 fundamentally different potential causes.
But the sources argue the structure of the event and how it was handled makes it impossible to distinguish between them based on the observable evidence. Both hypotheses lead to the exact same outcomes in terms of what we can actually see and verify today.
And that's the definition of an unfalsifiable narrative. You can't design an experiment or find a piece of evidence that could definitively prove one hypothesis and disprove the other. The setup prevents it.
Let's just quickly walk through those identical outcomes again, point by point. First, the evidence itself.
Okay. Hypothesis A, genuine accident. Evidence is inaccessible because the terrain is brutal, and 1956 tech like black boxes didn't exist to be recovered easily. Hypothesis B, engineered exploited crisis. Evidence is inaccessible because the government controlled the site, potentially didn't recover everything, and used terrain and sacred land restrictions to permanently block independent access. Identical observable outcome. The crucial physical evidence remains locked away, unexaminable.
Okay. Second, the investigation process.
Hypothesis A, genuine accident. The CAB investigates. As the existing authority, it's their job, even though they have an inherent interest in showing the old system failed to justify a new one. Hypothesis B, engineered exploited crisis. The CAB still investigates, but now they're essentially investigating themselves, or at least the conditions that allowed the engineered event to occur and succeed. Massive conflict of interest remains. Identical observable outcome. The investigation is controlled by a government entity with vested interests, and its conclusions cannot be independently verified against raw data.
Third, the big result, the FAA and new regulations.
Hypothesis A, genuine accident. The government sees the obvious need for reform after the tragedy and opportunistically uses the public outcry to pass the Federal Aviation Act of 1958. Hypothesis B, engineered exploited crisis. The crash was specifically designed or timed to create that public outcry and provide the undeniable justification needed to push through the pre-planned Federal Aviation Act. Identical observable outcome. The net result is a massive expansion of federal regulatory power and guaranteed markets for specific industries.
And finally, the possibility of independent verification now or later.
Hypothesis A, genuine accident. Impossible due to lack of 1956 technology, no data recorders, and the difficulty danger of accessing the remaining physical wreckage in the restricted zones. Hypothesis B, engineered exploited crisis. Impossible because the lack of 1956 tech provides perfect cover, and the controlled site access using terrain and sacred land as justification deliberately prevents any future independent examination of the physical evidence. Identical observable outcome. No independent party, then or now, can access the primary evidence needed to definitively confirm or refute the official narrative.
Wow. So if all the things we can actually point to today, the missing data, the restricted sites, the conflicted investigation, the regulatory outcome are exactly the same, whether it was a horrible accident or something more sinister, then how do you ever prove anything?
You can't. That's the core argument. The traditional idea of burden of proof kind of breaks down here. The skeptic can't prove hypothesis B because the evidence is locked away. But equally, the state can't independently prove hypothesis A for the very same reasons.
So the official story wins by default.
It wins by default. Cemented by the structural impossibility of contradiction, And this leads to the source's most critical takeaway for you, the listener. When the entity investigating an event, the government CAB, controls all access to the evidence, investigates itself or its own failures, directly benefits from a specific conclusion, and ensures that evidence is permanently inaccessible for independent review, then skepticism isn't paranoia. It becomes the default rational position. The system itself appears structured to prevent definitive proof either way, which, ironically, serves to solidify the official account simply because it cannot be effectively challenged.
So this deep dive has really taken us down a fascinating and frankly unsettling path. We started with the 1956 Grand Canyon crash, this pivotal moment in aviation history. And we've seen how it created this perfect evidential vacuum, amplified by these physically inaccessible crash sites, and how neatly it fits into a much longer historical pattern of crises being exploited or maybe even steered to benefit powerful interests, government and corporate.
Yeah, we've traced that playbook from, Bernays basically inventing demand for cigarettes to the military using complex alien narratives as a psyop tool to protect secrets. It's about narrative control. And the sources really hammer home this idea that our perception of reality isn't passive. It's actively shaped by the language we use, the stories we tell, the beliefs we collectively adopt. They talk about a linguistic rift, how language can actually fragment a unified experience into subjective, agreed-upon reality.
Which leads to that final kind of startling idea that we aren't just victims or observers of these narratives. In a way, we are the active architects of the glitch. We build the consensus reality by accepting, repeating, and enforcing these stories, often forgetting the inconvenient details through that process of socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting.
Absolutely. We participate in cementing the narrative. And the sources mention something interesting about the timeline of these things. That collective memory narratives, whether they're grounded in fact or built on hyperstition, they start to decay, to fade from public consciousness surprisingly quickly after the initial event, maybe after a few critical years.
Right. The intensity fades, the narrative solidifies, and the details get lost. So here's the final thought we want to leave you with this week, something to mull over as you encounter the news, the competing stories, the narratives swirling around current events. If reality, or at least our shared understanding of it, is constantly being negotiated, constructed moment by moment through these stories, what is that critical window of time, right after a major event happens? How long do you have to really dig in, enforce your own critical memory, seek out independent facts before the dominant, perhaps simplified or manipulated consensus narrative takes hold and pushes everything else out?
Is your personal attention span, your commitment to critical thinking, longer than the natural life cycle of a collectively constructed false or incomplete memory?
That's a challenging question. Maybe the ultimate challenge in navigating the information age.
It might just be.
Keep looking up, keep asking questions, and keep thinking critically. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.